Howdy, just want to make a couple of quick comments on the current round of interviews that Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson are doing in regards to their new book. And a lot of the discussion that I've seen, there are a few themes that keep coming up, most of which I think do nothing to justify the circumstances of Biden's presidency and what went on, particularly in the last couple of years of his presidency, with respect to the cover up and all that ensued. And the first thing I'd like to highlight, which is something we've been hearing for a while, is that he had good days and bad days. And the thing about that argument is that's the kind of conversation families have when they're trying to talk about who's going to approach mom or dad or grandma and grandpa and take the keys from the car away, or talk about getting some assistance in the medical assistance or living assistance, whatever the situation might be. It's not the kind of thing that boards have when they're discussing whether or not the CEO is doing the job, or that Congress people or cabinet members should be having when they're discussing whether or not the president is in fact fit to serve. This whole idea of good days and bad days just highlights the fact that Biden was not fit to serve to conclude his term, whether or not he was fit to even start his term, and certainly not fit to run for a second term. So that argument just is wrong on its face. The other argument I keep hearing now is that his inner circle, 4 or 5 individuals seem to be identified regularly, that they lied to themselves. And, the illustration that I keep hearing is the frog in the pot of water, turn the heat on and starts boiling. And before the frog realizes that he's boiled to death, that people on the inside, they just couldn't really see the change that was taking place. And they just lied to themselves and then lied to everybody else. Well, even if that is true to a degree, they lied. They weren't not honest about what was going on. And I think this is part of the critique that the press needs to face up to, is if you couldn't recognize what was happening with President Biden without being a doctor, without making any kind of medical diagnosis, if you couldn't recognize what was happening simply based on life experience, then one might wonder if you're qualified to judge anything related to the presidency and what's going on. If you have actually the qualifications, the basic qualifications to make judgment calls, if you fail to recognize what was obvious, as has been said so often, to the general public, to the point that even the majority of Democrats did not want President Biden to run because he was too old. But not just because he was too old, but because he was too old in a way that demonstrated that his leadership capabilities, his decision-making capabilities were compromised. And this is another issue that comes up often, not just in this context, but others. And it's a distinction I think we're having a hard time making today in both political parties and across the political spectrum. It's a difference between political miscalculation and cognitive incoherence in this particular matter with respect to President Biden. We too often, I think, are accusing people of even criminal acts, or even having failed judgment in a way that holds them liable for what takes place, rather than recognizing that based on different political understandings and calculations, people sometimes make the best choice they think can be made in a situation that turns out in hindsight to have been the wrong choice. But that's different from being unable to make a choice. It's different from referring to the history of a person's actions and saying, all things considered, if this person were able to think clearly, this is what they would do in this situation and going forward. The American people, in electing President Biden to serve as president, weren't electing him to serve 4 years based on what his history of decision making would suggest he would have done had he been able to think clearly during all 4 years. They were electing him, as they elect every leader in government, to serve in the moment, with the past giving evidence as to how they would decide and what they would decide in the moment, but always subject to their best judgment given current facts, given current information. And there's no indication that day in and day out, 24/7, President Biden was in any position to make those calls. I believe that Dr. Joe Biden, highlighted for the American people what the presidency is about when she tried to defend President Biden's service in the View interview by talking about it being a 24/7 job, reading briefings when nobody was watching, et cetera, et cetera. And yet there's ample testimony that, particularly during the last couple of years of President Biden's term, he was simply unable to function in a way that would allow him to handle what was demanded of the job. It's one thing to not be able to do a job, and it's one thing to try to excuse not being able to do a job on something such as aging, which all of us are dealing with day in and day out. And it's another thing to fail to recognize when one is unable to, or when someone to whom one is responsible, such as the cabinet and other political leaders, is unable to carry out the job, and then carrying out their duties to act 25th Amendment, whatever it is they need to do in a way that is in the best interest of the American people. And then the final thing I would note is that people, and they tried to do this particularly in the context of President Biden's term and in the campaign, keep trying to point to President Trump as an example. What about President Trump for getting a name, or this, that, and the other? And I haven't stopped. I've tried to do a little bit of Googling to see what the comparison is, but it boggles the mind to think that anybody thinks that a comparison between President Biden and his day-to-day appearances and activities during his whole presidency, let alone just the last 2 years, compares at all to what President Trump is able to do. Again, there's a difference between political preferences and political views, and simply the ability to have a cogent political view and to see that view carried out. Whether or not one likes or dislikes what President Trump accomplishes, there's no way that President Biden was or is ever going to be again able to keep up with the kind of tempo of pace that President Trump has maintained. He's likely to slow down over the next 3.5 years. He may, in fact, get to a point where he is no longer able to serve, but there is no comparison right now between President Trump's ability to serve and President Biden's ability to serve, particularly during the final 2 years of his presidency. And again, this has nothing to do with the politics or the moral character or anything else people want to point to when they're comparing the two individuals. It has simply to do with whether or not they were able to carry out their duties as President of the United States. So anyway, look forward to hearing what you have to say as this perpetual effort to address the present circumstances and what President Biden did and didn't do to bring us to this present circumstance, what his inner circle, including his family and closest advisors, did and didn't do to bring us to this present circumstance, the effort to try to avoid responsibility or explain away the fact that President Biden aged in a way that most of us, nearly all of us, would just as soon have happen in the context of close family as difficult decisions are being made. But we're talking about someone who is serving as President of the United States. Thank you very much. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Bye-bye. Thank you very much for your time. I've got a couple other videos listed here if you'd like to take a look at those. And as I'd like to discuss issues related to politics, religion, society, and how in the world we're supposed to understand ourselves and life in the world. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye bye.